You know that feeling when you're deep in the woods, maybe chasing that perfect photograph or tracking an elk through timber so thick you can barely see the sky? Everything's going according to plan until it isn't. One second you're stepping over what looks like solid ground. The next you're looking at your ankle bent in a direction God never intended. Most folks think wilderness injuries happen to the other guy, the weekend warrior who bought all his gear at REI and couldn't start a fire if his life depended on it. The city boy who thinks a GPS makes him Daniel Boone. But here's the thing that'll surprise you. The statistics say otherwise. The National Park Service keeps meticulous records, and they paint a picture that ought to make every outdoorsman think twice. Every year, over 4,000 people need serious medical evacuation from our national parks alone. That's not counting state forests, private land, or all the places where cell towers are just a memory. And here's the kicker, 60% of those evacuations involve men over 50. Guys who've been hunting since they could hold a rifle. Men who know which end of an axe does the cutting. Experience, it turns out, can be a double-edged sword. You get comfortable. You start taking risks that younger, more cautious versions of yourself wouldn't dream of. That steep ravine you would have walked around 20 years ago, now you figure you can handle it. That creek crossing that's running a little high, you've crossed worse. I learned this lesson the hard way from talking to Jim Patterson, a search and rescue coordinator out of Montana, who's pulled more broken bodies out of the wilderness than he cares to count. The most dangerous guy in the woods, Jim told me over coffee in a diner that still serves pie for breakfast, is the one who's been doing it for 30 years. He knows just enough to get himself in serious trouble, but not quite enough to get himself out. Jim's seen it all. The bow hunter who fell from his tree stand and lay there for 14 hours with a compound fracture, too proud to call for help until hypothermia started setting in. The fly fisherman who took what should have been a simple tumble on wet rocks and ended up with a head injury that scrambled his thinking so badly he wandered 3 miles in the wrong direction before collapsing. The grandfather taking his grandson on his first elk hunt, who stepped in a hidden hole and shattered his leg so completely that the bone punched through his jeans like a tent stake. Each of these men thought they knew what they were doing. Each of them had decades of outdoor experience, and each of them discovered that when things go wrong in the wilderness, they go wrong fast and they go wrong hard. But here's what separates the stories with happy endings from the ones that make you shake your head and pour another cup of coffee. It's not luck, and it's not gear, though both help. It's what I call the 3-minute rule. The 3-minute rule is simple, and it might be the most important thing you learn today. When you get hurt in the wild, really hurt, not just a scrape that needs a Band-Aid, you've got about 3 minutes before shock and adrenaline start making your decisions for you. 3 minutes while your thinking is still clear. 3 minutes to make the choices that determine whether you walk out on your own 2 feet or get carried out under a tarp. Most people waste those 3 minutes. They spend them cursing or panicking or staring at their injury like it might disappear if they look hard enough. The smart ones, the ones who make it home to tell the story, they use those 3 minutes like a mechanic uses the first few seconds after he hears a funny noise in an engine. They stop, they listen, they assess. What exactly happened? How bad is it really? What resources do I have? Who knows where I am? How long until someone comes looking? It sounds simple when you're sitting in your easy chair with a cold beer in your hand. It's a different story entirely when you're looking at your own bones sticking through your skin, and the nearest road might as well be on the moon. Your grandfather would have understood this instinctively, even if he never put it into words. Men who lived through the Depression and fought in wars knew something that GPS and satellite phones can't teach. When you're in trouble, the most important tool you have is the space between your ears. They knew how to stay calm when calm was the difference between living and dying. That generation grew up understanding that self-reliance wasn't just a nice idea, it was survival. When your closest neighbor lived 2 miles away and the doctor was a half-day's ride into town, you learned to handle emergencies with whatever was at hand. You learned to think through problems methodically because panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. They also understood something else we've mostly forgotten. Nature doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care how experienced you are, how good your gear is, or how many hunting seasons you've survived without a scratch. A twisted root doesn't check your resume before it trips you. A rock slide doesn't ask about your hiking credentials before it lets loose. Gravity works the same on a 70-year-old retired carpenter as it does on a 20-year-old college kid, and it's just as unforgiving. But here's the flip side of that harsh truth. Nature also doesn't play favorites when it comes to rewarding preparedness and clear thinking. The woods will kill you if you let them, but they'll also support you if you know how to work with them instead of against them. Every problem has a solution if you can stay calm long enough to find it. The stories I'm going to share with you over the next several hours aren't meant to scare you away from the outdoors. God knows we need more men who understand the value of wild places, not fewer. These stories are insurance policies, written in blood and hard experience. They're the knowledge that could save your life or the life of someone you care about. We're going to start at the beginning with the gear that actually matters when you're bleeding and the phone calls that could save your life before you even leave your truck. Because the best way to survive a wilderness injury is to be ready for it before it happens. Then we'll walk through what happens when minor injuries turn major, because that innocent-looking cut or twisted ankle has ended more outdoor adventures permanently than all the bear attacks and lightning strikes combined. You'll learn the field dressing techniques that work when your hands are shaking and your mind is racing, and why sometimes the textbook answer is the wrong answer. We'll tackle the big ones next, the broken bones and heavy bleeding that can kill you in minutes if you don't know what you're doing. You'll hear about the sound a femur makes when it snaps 2 miles from the nearest road, and why trying to splint that break might save the leg but kill the man. After that, we'll dive into the injuries that don't look like much but shut down everything, the silent killers that drop strong men in minutes, and hypothermia's cruel trick that makes victims take their clothes off just before they die. These are the ones that fool experienced outdoorsmen because they don't announce themselves with blood and broken bones. Then comes the MacGyver stuff, how to make life-saving medical devices out of whatever's in your pack or your pockets. You'll learn why duct tape might be more valuable than your first aid kit, and how a rolled-up magazine once became the difference between a man walking again or spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Communication and rescue is next, because getting found before it's too late is often more important than any medical treatment you can provide yourself. You'll discover the 3 signals that actually get rescuers' attention, and the dozen that don't. Plus, why staying put can be the hardest decision you'll ever make, and sometimes the smartest. We'll wrap up with the wisdom that could keep you from ever needing any of this knowledge, how to read the signs your body sends before disaster strikes, and the pre-trip ritual that veteran outdoorsmen swear by. Because the most important survival tool really is the one between your ears. Every story I'm going to tell you is true. Every technique has been tested in the field, often under conditions where failure meant death. Some of these lessons were learned the hard way by men who paid a steep price for their education. Others come from the quiet wisdom of search and rescue professionals who've seen every way things can go wrong and a few ways they can go right. This isn't about turning you into a wilderness paramedic. It's about giving you the knowledge and confidence to handle the crisis long enough for help to arrive, or to get yourself to help if that's what it takes. It's about honoring the tradition of self-reliance that built this country, while acknowledging that even the most self-reliant man sometimes needs a hand. The woods are calling, just like they always have. The difference between coming home with a good story and becoming someone else's cautionary tale often comes down to knowledge you hope you'll never need to use. But if the day comes when you do need it, and the statistics say that day might come sooner than you think, you'll be glad you took the time to learn from men who've walked this path before you. The first lesson starts before you even leave your truck, because the gear that actually matters when you're bleeding isn't what most people think it is. And there's one phone call that could save your life that has nothing to do with 911. Let me tell you about Dave Kellerman's first aid kit. Dave's been hunting the same patch of Wyoming backcountry for 43 years, ever since he got back from Vietnam and needed somewhere quiet to sort his head out. His first aid kit weighs 14 pounds, takes up half his pack, and contains enough medical supplies to stock a small clinic. Gauze rolls, antiseptic wipes, emergency antibiotics, splinting materials, Israeli bandages, a suture kit, even a collapsible stretcher. Dave's also been carrying a dead man's gear for the last 15 years. See, Dave never needed any of it when Jim Morrison took a bad fall off a ledge during their 2009 elk hunt. Jim, no relation to the rock star, just a retired pipe fitter from Casper, slipped on wet granite and dropped 12 feet onto a pile of rocks. Compound fracture of the left tibia, bone sticking out through his jeans like a broken fence post. Bleeding like a stuck pig and going into shock fast. Dave had his 14-pound kit. He had his wilderness first aid certification. He had everything the experts said he needed. What he didn't have was cell service, and what Jim needed was a helicopter and a trauma surgeon, not gauze pads and antiseptic wipes. Jim Morrison died 3 hours before search and rescue found them, despite having access to the most comprehensive wilderness first aid kit money could buy. He died because Dave spent the first critical hour trying to stabilize an injury that couldn't be stabilized in the field, instead of doing the one thing that might have saved Jim's life, getting him out of there. The gear that actually matters when you're bleeding isn't what the outdoor magazines want to sell you. It's not the fancy trauma kits with Israeli bandages and hemostatic powder. It's not the lightweight emergency shelters or the space-age splinting materials. It's 3 simple things that most men already carry without thinking about it: a way to stop bleeding, a way to stay warm, and a way to call for help. Everything else is just expensive weight that might make you feel better about your preparedness, but won't change the outcome when things go truly sideways. Start with bleeding control, because that's what kills people fastest. Forget the fancy clotting agents and compression bandages. The most effective bleeding control device ever invented is sitting in your toolbox right now. Duct tape. Not medical tape, not athletic tape. Duct tape. The gray stuff that fixes everything from broken tailpipes to leaky boats. Duct tape doesn't care if your hands are shaking or covered in blood. It sticks to wet skin, dirty clothes, even itself. You can use it to hold pressure dressings in place, seal sucking chest wounds, or create compression bandages that won't slip when you're hiking out over rough terrain. A roll of quality duct tape weighs 4 ounces and handles more bleeding emergencies than $50 worth of specialized medical supplies. The pressure dressing itself can be anything absorbent: a clean t-shirt, a bandana, even moss or pine needles if you're desperate. Your great-grandfather's generation knew this instinctively. They didn't have fancy medical supplies, so they used what was available: torn clothing, towels, whatever would absorb blood and allow pressure to be applied. For major bleeding, the kind that spurts with your heartbeat, direct pressure is everything. Place the absorbent material over the wound. Press down hard with both hands and keep pressing. Don't peek to see if it's working. Don't readjust the dressing. Just press and hold, like you're trying to stop a leak in a hydraulic line. If blood soaks through, add more material on top and keep pressing. The mistake most people make is thinking they need to do something fancy. They try to clean the wound, or apply antiseptic, or position the dressing just so. Meanwhile, the victim is bleeding out while they fiddle with their medical supplies. In the field, perfect is the enemy of good enough, and good enough means stopping the bleeding before you worry about anything else. Hypothermia kills more injured people than their actual injuries do, which brings us to the second essential: staying warm. When your body goes into shock from trauma, it starts shutting down blood flow to your extremities to preserve core temperature. Add cold weather, and you've got a countdown timer that's running faster than you think. The space blankets in most first aid kits are marginally better than nothing, but not by much. They tear easily, don't breathe, and create condensation that makes you colder in the long run. What works is layers of real clothing and a reliable way to generate heat. This is where your truck becomes critical medical equipment. Always carry extra clothes, not lightweight hiking gear, but real clothes. A wool sweater, an extra pair of jeans, thick socks, a warm hat. stuff that weighs a few pounds but could save your life if you get hurt and have to spend an unplanned night in the woods. The heat source can be as simple as chemical hand warmers, the kind deer hunters use during late season. They're cheap, lightweight, last for hours, and provide steady heat when you need it most. Slip them inside clothing against pulse points, wrists, neck, armpits, groin, and they'll help maintain core temperature even when your body is trying to shut down. Better yet is a small camp stove and fuel, not for cooking, but for heating water. A warm drink and the psychological comfort of a controlled flame can pull someone back from the edge of shock faster than any medication. Plus, you can use heated water to warm compress materials, which brings circulation back to injured areas and reduces pain. But the most important piece of gear is the one that gets you help when you can't help yourself: communication. And this is where most guys get it exactly backward. The satellite communicators and personal locator beacons are great if you can afford them and remember to carry them. But they're not the most important communication device for wilderness emergencies. That honor belongs to your truck's radio, assuming it's set up right. Here's what I mean. Every serious outdoorsman should have a CB radio in his truck, properly installed with a good antenna, not some cheap handheld unit from the gas station. Channel 4 is the unofficial backcountry emergency frequency, monitored by loggers, ranchers, other hunters, and anyone else who spends time in remote areas. More importantly, your CB reaches other people who are actually in the area and might be able to help immediately. That satellite beacon sends a signal to a rescue center hundreds of miles away, which then has to coordinate with local authorities, which then have to figure out where you are and how to get to you. That process takes hours, even under the best circumstances. But the CB signal reaches Jim Thompson, who's cutting timber 2 ridges over and can be at your location in 30 minutes with a crew, equipment, and a way out. It reaches the rancher, who knows every trail in the area and has horses that can carry an injured man where vehicles can't go. It reaches the other hunters who are camped within walking distance and didn't even know you were there. There's something else about CB radios that the satellite beacon crowd doesn't talk about. They work for routine communication too. You can check in with your hunting buddies, get weather updates, even just chat with other folks to break the monotony of a long day in the woods. That regular use means you know the radio works, you know how to operate it under stress, and you know who's listening in your area. The most important call you can make isn't to 911. It's the call you make before you leave your truck. Every time you head into the backcountry, even if it's just for a few hours, you should radio your plans to someone. Not your wife or your buddy back in town, but someone who's actually in the area and can do something if you don't check in. The hunter at the next campsite, the logger working the access road, the rancher whose property you're crossing. This is Dave, heading up Thompson Creek to scout for elk. Should be back to the truck by dark. If you don't hear from me by 9 tonight, I'm probably in trouble somewhere between the creek crossing and the high meadow. Simple, specific, and direct. You've just given someone the information they need to find you if things go wrong. And you've established a timeline that doesn't waste precious hours wondering if you're actually in trouble or just decided to stay out later than planned. This brings us to the most overlooked essential in any wilderness first aid kit: local knowledge. I don't mean knowing which berries are edible or how to build a shelter out of pine boughs. I mean knowing the area well enough to make smart decisions about routes, risks, and rescue options before you need them. The 10 essentials list that every outdoor education program teaches is missing this crucial element: familiarity with your specific hunting or fishing area. You should know where the nearest hospital is, how long it takes to drive there from different trailheads, which routes are impassable during different seasons, and where you can get cell service in an emergency. More importantly, you should know the informal network of people who spend time in your area, the guides who know every trail, the locals who check their trap lines regularly, the photographers who hike the same routes looking for wildlife. These people are your real safety net, not the official search and rescue teams who might take hours to respond and don't know the terrain like the locals do. Building these relationships takes time, but it's easier than you might think. Stop and chat when you meet other outdoorsmen. Share information about what you've seen and where you've been. Offer to help when someone's stuck or having trouble. The guy you help change a flat tire in September might be the one who finds you when you're hurt in November. There's something else your grandfather's generation understood that we've largely forgotten: the importance of routine. They didn't just wander into the woods whenever the mood struck them. They had patterns, habits, regular schedules that other people knew about and could count on. If old Frank didn't show up at the diner for coffee every Monday morning after checking his trap lines, people noticed. If Jim's truck wasn't parked at the usual spot by the creek on Saturday afternoon, his buddies went looking. That informal network of mutual awareness kept people alive in an era when communication was limited and professional rescue services barely existed. You can recreate that safety net today by being predictable in your outdoor activities. Hunt the same areas, follow the same routines, check in with the same people. It might seem boring compared to exploring new territory every time you go out, but predictability is a survival tool that saved more lives than all the fancy gear combined. The final piece of pre-trip preparation isn't gear at all, it's mindset. Before you leave your truck, take a minute to honestly assess your physical condition and your mental state. Are you dealing with a nagging injury that could become serious if aggravated? Are you distracted by problems at home or work? Are you pushing yourself to make this trip when part of you knows you should stay home? Your body sends signals long before it breaks down completely, but you have to be willing to listen. That slight twinge in your knee isn't just aging. It might be warning you that this isn't the day to attempt that steep climb you've been planning. The fatigue you've been ignoring all week might be your body's way of telling you that your reaction time and decision-making are compromised. This is where experience becomes a double-edged sword again. You've pushed through pain and fatigue before, so you figure you can do it again. But every time you ignore those warning signs, you're rolling the dice with higher stakes. The 20-year-old version of yourself could bounce back from mistakes that the 60-year-old version can't survive. The smartest outdoorsmen I know have learned to read their own gauges like they read their truck's dashboard. When something doesn't feel right, they pay attention. When their internal warning systems are flashing, they adjust their plans accordingly. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. But let's say you've done everything right. Your gear is squared away, your communication plan is solid, your local knowledge is current, and your physical condition is good. You've made the call to let someone know where you're going and when you'll be back. You're ready to head out for what should be a routine day in the woods. That's when you discover that all the preparation in the world can't prevent every accident. Sometimes bad things happen to well-prepared people, and knowing how to handle the minor injuries before they become major problems can make the difference between a good story and a tragedy. The innocent-looking cut that turns into a life-threatening infection. The twisted ankle that becomes a death sentence when you're miles from help. The field dressing techniques that work when you're shaking and scared, and the ones that don't. Bobby Hutchins thought he was having a pretty good day until the barbed wire taught him otherwise. It was opening day of deer season, 2018, and Bobby was making his way through a fence line that separated private land from the national forest where he'd been hunting for 15 years. Same fence he'd crossed dozens of times before, but this time he caught his forearm on a barb that was hiding under some overgrown brush. Not much of a cut, really. Maybe 2 inches long, not particularly deep. The kind of scratch you'd get working on your truck or cleaning out the garage. Bobby looked at it, decided it wasn't worth worrying about, and wrapped it with a bandana from his pocket. He had elk to hunt, and a little scratch wasn't going to ruin his season opener. 3 days later, Bobby Hutchins was fighting for his life in the ICU at Denver General, hooked up to machines that were doing the work his kidneys had stopped doing. The scratch had turned into necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating bacteria that spread up his arm faster than doctors could cut it away. They took his arm just below the elbow, and he spent 6 weeks in the hospital learning to write left-handed. The bacteria that nearly killed Bobby lives everywhere in the outdoors. It's in soil, on vegetation, in standing water, and yes, on rusty barbed wire that's been exposed to the elements for decades. Under normal circumstances, your immune system handles it just fine. But when you're tired, stressed, maybe fighting off a cold, and you give that bacteria a direct route into your bloodstream, through an open wound, normal circumstances go out the window fast. Bobby's story illustrates the first hard truth about wilderness injuries. There's no such thing as just a scratch when you're miles from medical care. Every cut, every puncture, every scrape is a potential gateway for the kind of infection that can kill you or cost you limbs. The woods are full of organisms that would love nothing more than to set up housekeeping in your warm, moist tissues, and they don't care how tough you think you are. But here's what Bobby learned too late, and what every outdoorsman needs to understand. Proper wound care in the field isn't complicated, but it is critical, and it starts with a principle that goes against every instinct you have when you see your own blood. Don't clean it. Not yet. I know that sounds backwards. Your grandmother told you to clean cuts with peroxide and iodine, and she was right when you're at home with running water and a medicine cabinet. But in the field, especially when you're dealing with bleeding that needs immediate attention, cleaning comes after stopping the bleeding, not before. Here's why. Every second you spend fiddling around trying to clean a wound is a second you're not controlling the bleeding. And while you're worried about getting dirt out of a cut, you could be losing enough blood to compromise your ability to think clearly and make good decisions. Dead men don't get infections. The first rule of field wound care is simple. Stop the bleeding, then worry about everything else. Direct pressure with the cleanest material you have available. Your t-shirt, a bandana, even your sock if that's what's handy. Don't remove the first layer of material if it gets soaked with blood. Add more layers on top and keep pressing. Once the bleeding stops, and I mean really stops, not just slows down, then you can think about cleaning. But even then, your approach should be different from what you do at home. Water is your best friend for cleaning wounds in the field, but it has to be the right kind of water, used the right way. If you've got bottled water, use it. If all you have is stream water, boil it first, if possible, or at least filter it through a clean cloth. The goal isn't sterility, that's impossible in the field, but removing the big chunks of debris that will cause problems later. Pour the water over the wound from a height of 6 inches or so. Let gravity and volume do the work instead of scrubbing with your fingers or a cloth. Scrubbing drives bacteria deeper into the wound and damages tissue that's trying to heal. Think of it like washing mud off your truck. You start with a strong stream of water to knock off the big stuff before you touch it with a brush. For puncture wounds, and this includes anything made by thorns, wire, nails, or animal teeth, cleaning becomes even more critical because bacteria get driven deep into tissue where your immune system has trouble reaching them. These wounds need to be irrigated under pressure, which sounds fancy, but just means forcing water deep into the wound channel. If you've got a plastic water bottle, you can create an irrigation system by punching a small hole in the cap with a knife tip. Fill the bottle with clean water, screw on the cap, and squeeze the bottle to force water through the hole and into the wound. The pressure helps flush out debris and bacteria that simple pouring can't reach. But here's where it gets tricky. Some wounds shouldn't be cleaned at all in the field, at least not immediately. If you've got a puncture wound with the object still in place, a stick, a piece of metal, anything that's gone deeper than skin level, leave it alone. Don't pull it out. Don't try to clean around it. Don't even wiggle it to see how deep it goes. That foreign object might be the only thing preventing massive bleeding from a damaged blood vessel. Pull it out in the field, and you could turn a manageable injury into a life-threatening hemorrhage with no way to control it. Stabilize the object with padding and tape to prevent it from moving around, and get to medical care as fast as possible. After cleaning comes protection, and this is where most people make their second big mistake. They assume that keeping a wound covered and moist is always better than letting it dry out. In a controlled medical environment, that's often true. In the backcountry, where moisture means bacteria growth and infection, it's often wrong. For most cuts and scrapes, your goal should be to let the wound dry out and form a protective scab as quickly as possible. That means cleaning it once, applying a thin layer of antibiotic ointment, if you have it, and then leaving it uncovered to air dry. Cover it only when necessary to protect it from further contamination, when you're sleeping or working in particularly dirty conditions. The exception is deep cuts that are likely to keep bleeding or gaping wounds that need to be held closed. These need pressure dressings that stay in place, but they also need to be checked and changed regularly to prevent infection from developing under the bandages. Which brings us to the injury that looks innocent, but kills more outdoorsmen than bear attacks, snake bites, and lightning strikes combined: the twisted ankle. Most guys have rolled an ankle before. It hurts like hell for a few minutes, swells up like a softball, and makes you walk funny for a week or two. No big deal. Ice it when you get home, pop some ibuprofen, and get on with your life. But when it happens 20 miles from the trailhead, with nobody expecting you back until Sunday, that innocent twisted ankle becomes your biggest enemy in the backcountry. The problem isn't the pain, though that's certainly part of it. The problem is mobility. Every step becomes a calculated risk. Your pace drops from 3 miles per hour to 1 mile per hour, if you're lucky. What should have been a 6-hour hike out becomes an 18-hour ordeal that pushes you past your physical and mental limits. But that's assuming you can walk at all. A severe ankle sprain, what doctors call a grade 3 sprain, involves complete tears of the ligaments that hold your ankle together. The joint becomes unstable, unable to bear weight without causing excruciating pain and further damage. Try to walk on it, and you might turn a bad sprain into a fracture that leaves you completely immobilized. Mike Reynolds learned this lesson during what should have been a routine day hunt in Colorado's Sangre de Cristo Range. Mike was working his way down a steep slope when he stepped on a loose rock that rolled out from under him. His foot went one way, his body went the other, and something in his ankle made a sound like a gunshot. Mike's first instinct was right. Sit down, assess the damage, and don't try to walk until you know what you're dealing with. His second instinct was wrong, assuming he could tough it out and hike the 12 miles back to his truck. 3 hours later, Mike was hypothermic, dehydrated, and stranded on a mountainside with an ankle that had swollen so badly he couldn't get his boot off. What started as a manageable injury had become a life-threatening situation because he made the classic mistake of trying to push through pain instead of dealing with reality. The reality of ankle injuries in the wilderness is this: if you can't bear full weight on it immediately, you probably can't hike out on it safely. And if you can't hike out, your survival depends entirely on how well you can improvise shelter, signal for help, and maintain your core body temperature until rescue arrives. That's where proper field treatment becomes critical, not just for the injury itself, but for your overall survival strategy. The goal isn't to fix the ankle. That's impossible in the field. The goal is to stabilize it enough that you can make rational decisions about what to do next. Start with the acronym every wilderness first aider knows: RICE, rest, ice, compression, elevation. But understand that wilderness RICE is different from living room RICE. Rest means stop walking on it immediately and find a comfortable position where you can think through your options without the distraction of pain. Don't test it every few minutes to see if it's feeling better. Give it at least 30 minutes of complete rest before you even think about trying to stand. Ice is whatever cold source you can find. Snow, cold stream water, even evaporation cooling if that's all you have available. The goal is to reduce swelling and numb the pain enough that you can think clearly. 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off. Don't overdo it. Frostbite on top of a sprain is not an improvement. Compression is where your duct tape really shines. Not directly on the skin, but over a sock or thin cloth wrapped around the ankle in a figure 8 pattern. Start at the foot, wrap around the ankle bone, back across the top of the foot, around the ankle again, and back to where you started. Firm pressure, but not tight enough to cut off circulation. You should be able to slip a finger under the wrap. Elevation means getting the injured ankle higher than your heart, if possible. Lie down with your foot propped up on your pack or a pile of rocks. This helps reduce swelling and makes the pain more manageable while you figure out your next move. But here's the part they don't teach in first aid classes. Field treatment of ankle injuries is as much about psychology as physiology. The moment you realize you can't walk out under your own power, panic starts setting in. Your mind starts racing through worst-case scenarios, and that mental spiral can be more dangerous than the injury itself. This is where the 3-minute rule becomes crucial. You've got a brief window while adrenaline is still helping you think clearly. Use it to make an honest assessment of your situation and your options. How long before someone comes looking for you? Do you have the gear to survive an unplanned night out? Is there any possibility of self-rescue? Or do you need to focus on signaling for help? The hardest decision many outdoorsmen face is admitting that they need help. There's something in the DNA of men who hunt and fish that rebels against the idea of being rescued. We'd rather crawl out on our hands and knees than admit we can't handle our own problems. But that pride has killed more people than all the natural hazards combined. If you can't bear weight on the ankle after 30 minutes of proper field treatment, you need help. Don't waste precious daylight hours trying to prove how tough you are. Don't risk turning a sprain into a fracture by attempting to walk on an unstable joint. Use your communication plan, activate your emergency signal, and prepare for rescue. The field dressing techniques that work when you're shaking and scared are the simple ones you can do with muscle memory, even when your fine motor control is compromised by cold, fatigue, or shock. Complex procedures that require steady hands and good lighting are useless when your hands are shaking and you're working by flashlight. That's why the basics matter more than the advanced techniques. Direct pressure for bleeding control, RICE for sprains and strains, immobilization for suspected fractures. These aren't glamorous skills, but they're the ones that save lives when everything else goes wrong. The advanced stuff, suturing wounds, reducing dislocations, managing airways, sounds impressive in a classroom setting. But in the field, when you're scared and shaking and your patient might be going into shock, simple techniques executed well beat complex procedures executed poorly every single time. There's something else about field treatment that the textbooks don't mention. Sometimes the best medicine is just staying calm and making the injured person feel like someone competent is in charge. Half of shock is psychological, and a calm, confident voice can literally be life-saving. We're going to be fine. I know exactly what to do here. Help is on the way, and we're going to get you out of here in good shape. Even if you're scared out of your mind, projecting confidence helps the patient stay calm, which improves their chances of survival and makes your job easier. But confidence without competence is dangerous, and competence comes from understanding not just what to do, but what not to do. Don't try to straighten bent limbs unless circulation is compromised. Don't remove impaled objects. Don't give water to someone who might need surgery. Don't move someone with a possible spinal injury unless staying put is more dangerous than moving. These don'ts are often more important than the do's because they prevent you from turning a manageable situation into a disaster through well-intentioned but misguided intervention. The other thing that separates effective field treatment from dangerous fumbling around is understanding the difference between injuries that need immediate action and injuries that can wait. Massive bleeding stops now, or the patient dies. Airway obstruction gets cleared now, or the patient dies. Everything else can wait long enough for you to think through your approach and gather your materials. This triage mindset, deciding what's most urgent, becomes critical when you're dealing with multiple injuries on the same person or multiple injured people. You might want to clean and bandage that nasty-looking cut on the forehead, but if the patient is also bleeding heavily from a leg wound, the leg gets your attention first. It's the same principle mechanics use when diagnosing complex problems. Fix what will kill the engine first, then worry about what makes noise or runs rough. In medical terms, that means airway, breathing, circulation, everything else in that order. But even perfectly executed field treatment has its limits, and recognizing those limits is crucial for survival. There are injuries that look manageable but hide life-threatening complications underneath. The broken rib that punctures a lung, the head bump that causes slow bleeding inside the skull, the abdominal injury that damages internal organs without much external evidence. These are the silent killers that drop strong men without warning, often hours after what seemed like a minor accident. They're the injuries that fool experienced outdoorsmen because they don't announce themselves with dramatic bleeding or obvious deformity, and they're exactly what we need to talk about next, because recognizing them early is often the difference between walking out of the woods and being carried out under a sheet. The sound Tom Hendricks heard when he stepped in that hidden hole wasn't like anything in his 40 years of hunting. Not the sharp crack of a breaking branch, not the pop of a dislocating joint. This was different, a wet, grinding snap that seemed to come from deep inside his leg, followed by a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Tom had been tracking a wounded elk through heavy timber in Idaho's Selway Bitterroot Wilderness when he stepped into what looked like solid ground, but turned out to be a hole hidden by fallen leaves. His right leg went down hard, his body kept going forward, and his femur, the strongest bone in the human body, snapped like a green stick under the combined forces of his weight, momentum, and the unforgiving edge of granite at the bottom of that hole. The sound a femur makes when it breaks is something you never forget, assuming you survive to remember it. It's the sound of your mobility disappearing, your independence ending, and your survival prospects shifting from probable to questionable in the span of a heartbeat. Tom's hunting partner, Ray Morrison, was 50 yards away when he heard Tom's scream echo through the timber. By the time Ray reached him, Tom was conscious, but going into shock, his right leg bent at an angle that made Ray's stomach turn. The broken femur had torn through the muscle and was pressing against the skin, creating a bulge that moved with Tom's pulse. Ray had been hunting with Tom for 15 years. They'd handled everything from heart attacks to bear encounters, always managing to get each other out of whatever trouble they'd stumbled into. But looking at Tom's leg, Ray knew they'd found the edge of what two men could handle alone in the wilderness. A broken femur is a whole different category of problem from the cuts and sprains we talked about earlier. We're not dealing with something you can tape up and walk off. We're talking about the structural failure of your body's load-bearing system, combined with internal bleeding that can kill you before the broken bone ever becomes the main issue. The femur is surrounded by some of the largest muscles in your body, and when it breaks, those muscles go into spasm, trying to protect the injured area. That spasm pulls the broken bone ends apart, creating more tissue damage and more bleeding. It's like a hydraulic cylinder failing under pressure. Once it lets go, everything connected to it starts falling apart. Internal bleeding from a femur fracture can easily exceed 2 liters, nearly half the blood in your body, and most of it happens where you can't see it or control it. The patient looks relatively stable on the outside, while they are slowly bleeding to death on the inside. By the time the symptoms of blood loss become obvious, you're often past the point where field treatment can make a difference. Ray understood this instinctively, even though he'd never taken a wilderness medicine course. He could see Tom getting paler by the minute, could feel his pulse getting faster and weaker. The broken leg was obvious, but the real enemy was invisible and working faster than anything Ray could do to stop it. This brings us to the hardest lesson in wilderness medicine. Sometimes the best treatment you can provide is to stop trying to treat the injury and focus everything on getting the patient to definitive medical care. The urge to do something is overwhelming when you're watching a friend suffer, but good intentions and inadequate techniques can make a bad situation worse. The textbook approach to femur fractures involves traction splints, devices that pull on the lower leg to realign the bone fragments and reduce internal bleeding. They work well when applied by trained paramedics who have the right equipment and can get the patient to surgery within the hour. They're worse than useless when applied by well-meaning amateurs who don't understand the mechanics involved. Ray had a basic splint kit in his pack, the kind sold at outdoor stores to hunters and backpackers who want to be prepared for emergencies. He'd even practiced using it on a first aid course mannequin that didn't scream when you moved it wrong. But looking at Tom's real injury, Ray realized that trying to apply traction with improvised gear might straighten the leg, but could easily tear through the damaged blood vessels and turn controllable internal bleeding into a fatal hemorrhage. Instead, Ray made the hardest decision of his hunting career. He stopped worrying about the broken leg and focused on keeping Tom alive long enough for help to arrive. The first priority wasn't the fracture, it was shock prevention. Tom was losing blood internally, which meant his cardiovascular system was fighting a battle it couldn't win. Ray couldn't stop the bleeding, but he could give Tom's body every possible advantage in that fight. Elevation of the uninjured leg to help blood return to the heart. Extra clothing to prevent heat loss, because hypothermia kills trauma patients faster than their injuries do. Small sips of water to prevent dehydration, since Tom wasn't vomiting and surgery was hours away even under the best circumstances. Most importantly, calm reassurance to prevent the psychological component of shock from accelerating the physical decline. Ray also did something that probably saved Tom's life. He stopped trying to move him. The natural instinct when someone is badly hurt is to get them somewhere more comfortable, somewhere that feels safer. But moving a patient with a femur fracture and internal bleeding can be like shaking a bottle of soda. It accelerates the very processes that are trying to kill them. Tom stayed exactly where he fell for the next 6 hours, while Ray worked his CB radio and coordinated with search and rescue. It was the longest 6 hours of Ray's life, watching his friend fade in and out of consciousness while fighting the urge to do something, anything, that felt like progress. The helicopter crew that finally extracted Tom said later that Ray's decision not to attempt splinting probably prevented a fatal hemorrhage. The broken bone had torn through the femoral artery, and any traction or manipulation could have widened that tear beyond the body's ability to compensate. Sometimes the best medicine is knowing when not to practice medicine. Tom spent 3 months in the hospital and another 6 in rehabilitation, but he walked out on his own 2 feet. Ray's restraint had saved his friend's life by resisting the urge to help. But not all broken bones hide their danger inside muscle tissue. Sometimes the threat is immediate, visible, and pumping your life away with every heartbeat. External bleeding from traumatic injuries comes in 3 varieties, and recognizing which type you're dealing with determines your survival strategy. Capillary bleeding is slow and steady, like water dripping from a leaky faucet. Venous bleeding flows faster and steadier, like water from a garden hose. Arterial bleeding spurts with the rhythm of your heartbeat, like a pressure washer that's trying to empty your circulatory system as quickly as possible. Capillary and venous bleeding you can usually control with direct pressure and time. Arterial bleeding is trying to kill you right now, and you have minutes to stop it or watch someone die. Jake Miller discovered this difference the hard way during what should have been a routine morning of dove hunting in South Texas. Jake was climbing over a barbed wire fence when his shotgun, which should have been unloaded and handed over separately, discharged and sent a load of number 8 shot through his thigh at close range. Small shot, small holes, right? That's what Jake thought until he looked down and saw blood spurting from his leg in rhythmic jets that reached 3 feet from the wound. The shot had severed his femoral artery, and he was bleeding out faster than most people would believe possible. Jake's hunting partner, Eddie Rodriguez, had about 3 minutes to save Jake's life. The textbook response would have been to apply direct pressure over the wound, but Eddie was dealing with multiple small holes instead of one large cut, and the blood was coming too fast for conventional pressure dressing to work. What Eddie did next violated every first aid protocol, but it kept Jake alive long enough to reach medical care. Eddie jammed his thumb directly into the largest hole and pressed down until he felt the torn artery underneath. Then he held that pressure while using his other hand to wrap everything he could find around the wound. Jake's belt, Eddie's bandana, even Eddie's own shirt. The pressure point technique Eddie used is dangerous when applied incorrectly, but it's sometimes the only option when conventional methods fail. By pressing directly on the damaged blood vessel, he created enough back pressure to slow the bleeding while the body's clotting mechanisms had time to work. But Eddie also understood something that saved Jake's life in a different way. He knew when to stop trying to be a medic and start being a driver. After controlling the immediate hemorrhage, Eddie didn't waste time trying to create the perfect dressing or position Jake for transport. He half carried, half dragged Jake to the truck and drove toward town at speeds that would have gotten him arrested under normal circumstances. Jake lost 4 units of blood before reaching the hospital, but he lived because Eddie understood the most important principle in managing severe bleeding. Time matters more than technique. Perfect medical care delivered too late is worthless. Adequate medical care delivered immediately saves lives. This principle applies to every aspect of managing major bleeding. Your first intervention, the one you apply in the first 30 seconds, is usually your most important one. If direct pressure doesn't control the bleeding immediately, you need to escalate to more aggressive techniques quickly, not spend 10 minutes trying to make direct pressure work better. The escalation ladder for bleeding control goes like this: direct pressure, pressure with elevation, pressure points, and finally, tourniquets. Each step is more aggressive and more risky than the last, but when someone is bleeding to death, the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of doing something imperfect. Tourniquets get a bad reputation in first aid circles because they can cause permanent damage if applied incorrectly or left in place too long. But they also stop arterial bleeding instantly when nothing else will work, and permanent damage is preferable to permanent death. A proper tourniquet needs to be at least 2 inches wide and applied between the wound and the heart, close enough to the body that it can compress the main artery against bone. Narrow straps or cords will cut through tissue without stopping blood flow. Anything improvised, belts, rope, bungee cords, should be used only when commercial tourniquets aren't available. The key to improvised tourniquets is mechanical advantage. You need a way to generate more pressure than your hands can apply directly. A belt or strap wrapped around the limb with a stick used as a windlass to twist it tight can generate enough pressure to stop arterial bleeding, but only if the strap is wide enough to distribute that pressure over a large area. Mark the time when you apply a tourniquet, write it on the patient's forehead with a pen if necessary. Hospital staff need to know how long the limb has been without circulation to determine if it can be saved. Generally speaking, you have about 2 hours before permanent damage becomes unavoidable, but don't let that timeline make you hesitate to apply one when the alternative is watching someone bleed to death. The mistake most people make with tourniquets is not making them tight enough. If you can still feel a pulse below the tourniquet, it's not tight enough to stop arterial bleeding. If the patient can still wiggle their fingers or toes, it's not tight enough. A properly applied tourniquet should eliminate all circulation below the application point, and it should hurt enough that the patient complains about the tourniquet more than the original injury. But even perfect bleeding control is meaningless if you're dealing with injuries that damage systems you can't fix in the field. Internal bleeding from organ damage, compromised airways from facial trauma, or the kind of systemic shock that shuts down multiple organ systems simultaneously. These are the injuries that look manageable on the outside but hide catastrophic damage underneath. The chest injury that seems minor until the lung collapses. The abdominal trauma that doesn't show much external damage while internal organs are tearing apart. The head injury that seems like a simple concussion while pressure builds inside the skull. Carl Watson thought he was dealing with a simple broken rib when he took that fall from his tree stand during bow season. The rib was definitely broken. He could feel the sharp ends grinding together when he breathed. But broken ribs heal, and Carl had work to do. He climbed down carefully, took some ibuprofen, and continued hunting. 4 hours later, Carl was struggling to breathe and developing what he described as the worst pain I've ever felt. The broken rib had punctured his lung, allowing air to leak into the chest cavity where it didn't belong. That air was building pressure around the lung, compressing it against the heart and major blood vessels. Carl was experiencing tension pneumothorax, a condition that can kill you in minutes once it reaches the critical point. The air pressure in his chest was acting like a tourniquet around his heart, preventing blood from returning to be pumped to the rest of his body. No amount of field splinting or pain medication was going to fix that problem. Tension pneumothorax is one of those injuries that separates wilderness first aid from wilderness medicine. Recognizing it requires understanding how chest mechanics work. Treating it requires procedures that are well outside the scope of what most outdoorsmen should attempt. But understanding it can help you recognize when someone needs immediate evacuation instead of field treatment. The signs are progressive difficulty breathing, decreasing blood pressure, and distended neck veins as pressure builds in the chest. The patient becomes increasingly agitated and feels like they're suffocating because they essentially are. Without immediate decompression, which involves inserting a needle into the chest cavity to release the trapped air, the patient will die regardless of how well you manage their other injuries. This is where the hard decisions come in. Do you attempt a procedure you're not trained for because the alternative is watching someone die? Do you focus on rapid evacuation and hope you can get them to definitive care before the condition becomes fatal? Do you try to keep them calm and comfortable while accepting that some problems are beyond what field medicine can solve? There's no easy answer, and every situation is different. But the principle remains the same. Understand your limitations, and don't let the desire to help push you into attempting procedures that are more likely to harm than heal. The same logic applies to internal bleeding from abdominal trauma. The abdomen contains major blood vessels and solid organs that can hemorrhage internally without much external evidence. Someone can be bleeding to death inside their belly while showing nothing more dramatic than bruising and tenderness on the outside. Internal abdominal bleeding is another injury that can fool experienced outdoorsmen because it doesn't announce itself with dramatic symptoms. The patient may feel nauseated, complain of shoulder pain, or just seem unusually tired. Meanwhile, they're slowly going into shock from blood loss that you can't see or control. The shoulder pain is actually a diagnostic clue that most people miss. When blood irritates the diaphragm, the muscle that separates the chest from the abdomen, it can cause referred pain that the patient feels in their shoulder blade. It's the body's way of saying that something is seriously wrong inside, even when the outside looks relatively normal. These hidden injuries are why mechanism of injury, how the accident happened, is often more important than what you can see. A fall from height that results in nothing but bruises might still have caused internal damage that will become life-threatening hours later. A vehicle accident that produces only minor cuts might have generated enough G-forces to tear internal organs loose from their attachments. Understanding mechanism of injury helps you make decisions about evacuation priorities, even when the visible injuries don't seem serious. Someone who fell 20 feet and landed on their back needs immediate medical evaluation, regardless of how they feel, because the forces involved are capable of causing injuries that won't become apparent until it's too late to treat them. This is another area where the 3-minute rule becomes critical. You have a brief window after any serious accident to honestly assess not just what you can see, but what forces were involved and what hidden damage might be developing. Use that time to make evacuation decisions based on mechanism of injury, not just visible trauma. But sometimes the mechanism is obvious, the injuries are visible, and the bleeding is immediate. These are the dramatic trauma scenarios that most people picture when they think about wilderness emergencies. The compound fractures with bone protruding through skin, the deep lacerations that expose underlying structures, the crushing injuries that damage multiple systems simultaneously. These injuries demand immediate, aggressive intervention, but they also require you to think like a triage nurse, instead of focusing on the most dramatic problem first. What's going to kill the patient fastest? Massive bleeding gets addressed before broken bones. Airway problems get addressed before bleeding. Breathing problems get addressed before everything else. It's the same systematic approach that experienced mechanics use when diagnosing complex problems. Fix what will stop the engine first, then worry about what makes it run rough. In trauma medicine, that means airway, breathing, circulation, disability, everything else, in that order. But even when you follow the proper sequence, there are injuries that will overwhelm your ability to help. The kind of trauma that requires surgical intervention, blood transfusions, and intensive care monitoring to survive. These are the injuries that humble even experienced emergency medical professionals, and they're completely beyond what field treatment can address. Recognizing these injuries early, Understanding when field treatment is inadequate and evacuation is the only option is one of the most important skills an outdoorsman can develop. It's the difference between spending critical time on interventions that can't work and focusing on the one thing that might, getting the patient to people who have the tools and training to handle injuries that are beyond field medicine. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone with catastrophic trauma is to keep them comfortable and calm while focusing your energy on getting help there as quickly as possible. It's a hard truth that goes against every instinct to do something, but it's also the reality of wilderness medicine practiced at the limits of what's possible. But not every serious injury is beyond field intervention. There are techniques that can buy you time, procedures that can prevent bad injuries from becoming fatal ones, and equipment you can improvise from materials you're already carrying. The key is knowing which battles you can win and which ones require reinforcements. The injuries that don't announce themselves with blood and bone, the silent killers that drop strong men without warning, often hours after what seemed like a minor accident. They're the ones that fool experienced outdoorsmen because they hide their danger behind symptoms that seem manageable until they suddenly aren't. Dr. Sarah Chen has been pulling bodies out of the wilderness for 23 years, first as a flight paramedic and now as the medical director for Colorado's Front Range Search and Rescue. She's seen every way the outdoors can kill you: bear maulings, lightning strikes, falls from impossible heights, hypothermia, dehydration, and accidents so bizarre they defy explanation. But the cases that keep her awake at night aren't the dramatic ones with obvious causes of death. They're the ones where strong, experienced outdoorsmen simply lay down and died from injuries that should have been survivable, often hours or even days after the initial accident. The woods are full of silent killers, Dr. Chen told me over coffee in her cluttered office, surrounded by case files that read like a catalog of everything that can go wrong when you're far from help. Injuries that look like nothing but shut down everything. The guy who takes a simple fall, walks another 5 miles, makes camp, and never wakes up. The hunter who complains about feeling tired after a minor vehicle accident and dies in his sleep that night. These are the deaths that puzzle families and frustrate investigators because they don't make sense on the surface. The victim was conscious, talking, even walking around after the injury. They seemed fine, then they weren't. What Dr. Chen has learned from decades of investigating these cases is that the most dangerous injuries are often the ones you can't see. They work quietly, systematically shutting down vital systems while the victim remains conscious and functional right up until the moment they collapse. The silent killer that drops more strong men than any other is one most outdoorsmen have never heard of: cerebral edema following mild traumatic brain injury. In plain English, brain swelling after what seems like a minor head bump. Here's how it works and why it's so deadly in the wilderness. Your brain sits inside your skull like a walnut inside its shell, cushioned by fluid, but with very little room to expand. When brain tissue swells from injury, that swelling has nowhere to go. The pressure builds inside the rigid skull until it starts compressing vital structures, the parts that control breathing, heart rate, and consciousness. The cruel part is that this process can take hours or even days to reach the critical point. The victim feels fine immediately after the injury, maybe a little headache, maybe slightly nauseous. Nothing that seems serious enough to cut short a hunting trip or worry about getting immediate medical attention. But inside their skull, pressure is building like water behind a dam. The brain tissue is swelling, blood vessels are being compressed, and oxygen delivery to critical areas is being slowly choked off. By the time symptoms become obvious, confusion, severe headache, vomiting, loss of consciousness, the process has usually progressed beyond the point where field treatment can help. Marcus Delacroix learned this lesson during what should have been a celebration. Marcus had just shot his first elk after 15 years of trying, a beautiful 6-point bull that had stepped into a clearing just before sunset on the last day of the season. In his excitement to get to the animal, Marcus slipped on wet rocks while crossing a creek and took a hard fall that knocked him unconscious for maybe 30 seconds. His hunting partner, Dave Kowalski, helped Marcus to his feet and asked if he was okay. Marcus said he was fine, except for a mild headache. He seemed alert and oriented, answered questions appropriately, and insisted on helping Field dress the elk. They worked until well after dark, made camp, and celebrated Marcus's success with a small bottle of whiskey Dave had been saving for just such an occasion. Marcus went to sleep around midnight, complaining of nothing more than being tired and having a slight headache. Dave found him the next morning, still in his sleeping bag, dead from what the medical examiner would later determine was increased intracranial pressure from a slowly expanding hematoma, a blood clot that had been building pressure inside his skull all night. The tragedy is that Marcus's death was probably preventable if Dave had known what signs to watch for. Brain injuries in the wilderness require a different approach than the standard first aid advice of rest and monitor. When you're hours from medical care, monitor becomes a life or death responsibility that most people aren't trained for. The key signs of increasing brain pressure are subtle at first, but become obvious if you know what to look for. Changes in mental status are often the first clue. The patient becomes confused, repeats questions, or seems unusually irritable or drowsy. They might complain of nausea or vomit repeatedly. Their pupils might react differently to light, or one might be larger than the other. But the most reliable early warning sign is something called the lucid interval, a period where the patient seems to be getting better after initially being worse. They wake up from unconsciousness, seem alert and normal, and insist they're fine. This improvement can last for hours, lulling everyone into thinking the danger has passed. In reality, the lucid interval is often the calm before the storm. The brain injury that caused the initial unconsciousness is still there, still causing swelling and bleeding. The patient feels better temporarily because their brain is compensating for the injury, but that compensation has limits. When those limits are reached, the patient's condition deteriorates rapidly and often fatally. If someone loses consciousness from a head injury in the wilderness, even briefly, they need immediate evacuation to medical care, regardless of how good they feel afterward. This isn't negotiable, and it's not something you can treat effectively in the field. The stakes are too high and the window for effective treatment too narrow to risk waiting and seeing what happens. But brain injuries aren't the only silent killer that stalks injured outdoorsmen. There's another one that's even more insidious because it masquerades as something completely different: fat embolism from long bone fractures. When major bones like the femur or tibia break, fat from the bone marrow can leak into the bloodstream and travel to the lungs, brain, and other vital organs. This fat acts like microscopic blood clots, blocking small blood vessels and preventing oxygen from reaching the tissues they supply. The symptoms can take hours or days to develop, and they often look like something else entirely. The patient might complain of shortness of breath, confusion, or skin changes that look like a rash. They might seem to be developing pneumonia or having some kind of allergic reaction. Meanwhile, fat emboli are systematically shutting down their organ systems. Fat embolism is why some broken bone patients who seem stable suddenly take a turn for the worst days after their injury. It's another reason why major fractures require immediate evacuation, even when the patient's vital signs are stable and the bleeding is controlled. The lesson here is that mechanism of injury trumps apparent severity when you're making evacuation decisions. High-energy trauma, falls from height, vehicle accidents, crushing injuries, creates the potential for delayed complications that won't show up in your initial assessment, but can be fatal hours or days later. This brings us to the killer that most outdoorsmen recognize but often underestimate: hypothermia. Not the dramatic kind where someone falls through ice or gets caught in a blizzard, but the slow, insidious kind that creeps up on injured people who think they're dressed warmly enough. When your body is dealing with trauma, it diverts blood flow away from your extremities to preserve core temperature and maintain blood pressure in vital organs. This makes you much more susceptible to cold than you would be under normal circumstances. Add shock, pain, and the stress of being injured in the wilderness, and your body's temperature regulation system starts failing much faster than you'd expect. The early stages of hypothermia are subtle and often mistaken for something else. The patient becomes quiet and withdrawn, stops complaining about pain, and seems unusually cooperative. They might say they're tired and want to rest, or that they're feeling better and don't need help anymore. These aren't good signs. They're warning signs that the brain is starting to shut down non-essential functions to preserve energy for vital systems. The patient feels better because hypothermia has a natural analgesic effect, reducing pain and creating a false sense of improvement. As core temperature continues to drop, the patient's decision-making becomes increasingly impaired. They might start doing things that seem completely irrational, taking off layers of clothing when they should be putting more on, wandering away from shelter, or refusing help when they desperately need it. This is the cruel trick that hypothermia plays in its final stages. Victims often remove their clothes because their temperature regulation system has become so confused that they feel overheated even as they're dying from cold. Searchers regularly find hypothermia victims partially or completely undressed, which used to puzzle investigators until they understood the physiological mechanism involved. The technical term is paradoxical undressing, and it happens when the muscles controlling blood vessel constriction become so exhausted that they suddenly relax, causing a rush of warm blood to the extremities. The victim feels a sudden sensation of overheating and starts removing clothes to cool down, accelerating the very process that's killing them. Terminal burrowing is the final stage, where hypothermia victims seek out small, enclosed spaces. Under bushes, in shallow depressions, even in snow caves they dig with their bare hands. It's an instinctive behavior that parallels what many animals do when they're dying, but it's also what makes hypothermia victims so difficult to find during search operations. Understanding these behaviors is critical for wilderness medicine because it changes how you approach temperature management in injured patients. Keeping someone warm isn't just about comfort. It's about preventing a cascade of physiological changes that can turn a survivable injury into a fatal one. But effective warming in the wilderness requires more than just adding layers of clothing. Someone who's already hypothermic can't generate enough body heat to warm themselves up, no matter how much insulation you provide. They need an external heat source that can warm them faster than they're losing heat to the environment. This is where your camping stove becomes medical equipment again. Heating water for warm drinks, warming compress materials, even just having the psychological comfort of a controlled flame can help prevent or reverse early hypothermia. Chemical hand warmers placed against pulse points, neck, wrists, armpits, groin, can provide continuous heat where it does the most good. But there's a critical mistake that kills more hypothermia patients than the cold itself: rewarming them too quickly. Rapid rewarming can cause dangerous changes in blood chemistry and heart rhythm that can be fatal even when the hypothermia itself was survivable. The safest approach in the field is gradual, gentle rewarming combined with insulation to prevent further heat loss. Warm drinks if the patient can swallow safely, external heat sources against pulse points, and dry insulation around the core. Avoid hot baths, heating pads, or any warming method that raises core temperature rapidly. The other killer that masquerades as minor injury is internal bleeding from blunt trauma, especially to the abdomen and pelvis. These injuries can be completely hidden from external examination, while the patient bleeds to death internally from damaged organs or torn blood vessels. The abdomen is particularly vulnerable because it contains solid organs, liver, spleen, kidneys, that can tear or rupture from relatively minor impact. The pelvis contains major blood vessels that can be damaged when pelvic bones are fractured. In both cases, the bleeding is internal, invisible, and potentially fatal without surgical intervention. The signs of internal bleeding are subtle at first, but become more obvious as blood loss progresses. The patient might complain of thirst, feel nauseated, or become increasingly anxious and restless. Their pulse gradually becomes faster and weaker. Their skin becomes pale and clammy, and they might complain of feeling cold even in warm conditions. Referred pain is another clue that's easy to miss. When blood irritates the diaphragm, the muscle that separates the chest from the abdomen, it can cause pain that the patient feels in their shoulder blade rather than their abdomen. Someone who complains of unexplained shoulder pain after any kind of trauma to the torso might be bleeding internally. The challenge with internal bleeding is that you can't see it, can't control it, and can't treat it effectively in the field. Your only option is rapid evacuation while supporting the patient's cardiovascular system as much as possible. Keep them warm, elevate their legs if they're not vomiting, and get them to definitive medical care as quickly as possible. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of these silent killers is how they interact with each other. A patient with a minor head injury might develop hypothermia faster because their temperature regulation is impaired. Someone with internal bleeding might become hypothermic because they don't have enough blood volume to maintain circulation to their extremities. A broken bone patient might develop fat embolism and brain complications simultaneously. These cascading failures are why wilderness medicine is so different from urban emergency medicine. In the city, you can treat individual problems in isolation because help is minutes away. In the wilderness, you have to think systemically about how injuries interact with each other and with environmental stresses over extended periods. The patient who seems stable at hour 1 might be in serious trouble at hour 6, not because their original injury got worse, but because the physiological stress of that injury combined with cold, dehydration, and exhaustion to create new problems that are worse than the original trauma. This is why the decision to evacuate versus treat in the field often comes down to time and resources rather than the apparent severity of the injury. Someone with a broken leg and mild hypothermia might be fine if you can get them warm and dry in an hour. The same patient might die if rescue is 12 hours away and you don't have adequate shelter and heat sources. Environmental factors become part of the medical equation in ways that most people don't consider. Weather conditions, time of day, distance to help, available resources, and even the physical and mental condition of the rescuers all affect patient outcomes. Sometimes the best medical decision is determined by factors that have nothing to do with medicine. But recognizing these silent killers early, understanding that minor injuries can have major consequences in the wilderness environment, is the first step in preventing them from becoming fatal. It's about changing your decision-making threshold from "this seems manageable" to "this could become unmanageable" when you're far from help. The outdoorsman who understands these hidden dangers makes different choices about risk, different decisions about evacuation, and different preparations for dealing with injuries that seem minor but have the potential to become serious over time. But understanding the problems is only half the battle. The other half is knowing what you can actually do about them when you're miles from help with limited resources and improvised equipment. Sometimes the difference between living and dying comes down to your ability to create life-saving medical devices from whatever happens to be in your pack or your truck.